Right then guys, today we're going to look at natural selection and adaptation, how those two things are connected and what that means for animals on the planet. So the question then is, would you rather bet £100 on the polar bear surviving longer or the giraffe surviving longer? Obviously the polar bear we know is well adapted for cold conditions. And I would suspect that the giraffe would not last very long if put into cold conditions like in this photo. So here's the lesson. How are animals adapted to their environment? We're going to look at adaptation. We're going to hopefully be able to define it. We're going to look at how adaptations might help camouflage, temperature and feeding. And we're also going to look at the method by which adaptation takes place, which we call natural selection. So which one of these four people do you think is correct? Is it A, adaptations are characteristics that animals have? B, adaptation describes the differences between individuals? C, an adaptation is a characteristic that enables an animal to survive in its environment? Or D, adaptation is where animals compete for food or other resources? Well, you could really make a case that it be A, adaptations are the characteristics that animals have. But I think C is a more complete definition. An adaptation is a characteristic that enables an animal to survive in its environment. B is very clearly wrong. Variation is the differences between individuals. And D is also incorrect. Competition is the word we use to describe where animals compete for food or other resources. Now this is a video I'm going to link in the description, which I think is probably the greatest biology video ever made. So there's some mild debate over that, but please do go ahead and watch that. Pause this one, go and watch that video, and then come back to this one and carry on where you left off from. So the definition that they use in that video, changes in a body to fit a location. That is true, but it leads to a slight misnomer. Okay, it leads to this idea that maybe animals can choose to adapt themselves to their environment, and it's something that we as humans do. We maybe clothe ourselves differently in order to adapt to a cold day or a hot day, but the large majority of animals obviously can't do that. And so when we talk about adaptation from a biological point of view, we're talking about physical changes in the body. Okay, and obviously I can't choose to change how fast I am. I can't change how tall I am, much as I would want to. These are things that I can't change. I am not adapted to be really tall. So, if we consider that the polar bear's shape, the body of a polar bear is a particular shape to stop them losing heat. Okay? I'd like you in your books to pick one adaptation and explain how it helps the polar bear survive. You can use the little sentence structure underneath if you would like to. Here's another little video showing how the cheetah is adapted. I will link a handful of different videos in the description with a whole bunch of different animals. Feel free to pick a couple and write about how those animals are adapted. What is it about them? What changes do they have in their physical makeup, or maybe in the way that they are, what they do, how the way they act? Have they got things about them that change the way that they are able to survive? So, if I took my giraffe and my polar bear and I put them in the middle of a desert like this, which animal is going to survive the longest? And why is that? Okay, I'd like you to give me an explanation of how you think the giraffe is well adapted for this environment. But I'd also like you to give me an explanation of why you think the polar bear would really struggle in this environment. See if you can make it as detailed as you can. Okay, I don't just want you to tell me that the polar bear would overheat and die. I'd like you to be as specific as you can. What exactly does the polar bear have wrong about itself? What adaptations does the polar bear not have that mean it can't survive in the desert? So once again, a little review. Okay, adaptation is a characteristic that enables an animal to survive. Okay, that's B. Confusingly, I've shuffled around all the bubbles. So some of them were correct last time and are now not correct this time. Okay, so we know that species are adapted to suit their environment. Okay, for example, the camel, the polar bear, we've looked at those. Okay, what happens to those that aren't well adapted? Well, I mean, I'm sure that you can tell me they die. And this is a process that we call survival of the fittest, which might be a term you've come across before. Okay, so Charles Darwin had a very similar idea. He went on a boat ride. The boat was called the Beagle, and he stopped at a tiny little set of islands just off of the coast of South America called the Galapagos Islands. He actually was on our money for quite a long time, but I think he is either being replaced or has just been replaced. He discovered a whole bunch of unique species that had never been discovered before, and one of the species that he's famous for looking at was the finch, which you can actually see on this £10 note here. It's obviously a type of bird, and he discovered that on each of the islands there was actually a difference, or many differences, between the way that the finches looked. And he suggested that on each island the finches had adapted over time, over many generations, and that therefore their beaks helped them feed on different types of food. So he said, or his theory was that over many, many generations, these birds had evolved to become better adapted to their island. Now, they didn't choose. He proposed a mechanism by which this happened, and he said, well, first of all, I think there might be some change in one or two of the finches that we now call a mutation. That mutation gave them an adaptation, a physical change in the body, maybe a bigger beak or maybe a narrower beak. This new beak enabled them to survive, and it was this survival that's really important, because their better beak helped them to survive more frequently. The birds that survive could reproduce, and that's important because it meant that their offspring would have the new genes, or likely have the new genes. Now, he didn't know anything about how DNA was passed on, and that would be discovered after he died by a guy called Gregor Mendel. And that was one of the reasons that people had issues with what Darwin was talking about, because he didn't have the mechanism by which the DNA could be passed on. He was unable to say why or how this was actually happening. And people didn't like the theory because it suggested that human beings must have evolved from something that looked like us, and therefore we must have evolved from monkeys, which had clashing implications with the church, particularly at the time. Different islands in the Galapagos have different habitats and food types. Why might different species of finch exist on different islands? And how did Darwin use natural selection to explain what he saw on the Galapagos? Now, obviously, you're not going to share your ideas with the class as it says here, but I would like you to have a little Google at the different islands of the Galapagos and the finches that live there. And maybe about what type of food the finches that live on each of these islands eat. How are the different beak shapes and sizes, meaning these finches are really well adapted. Which brings us full circle back to adaptation. How are animals like finches adapted to their environment? Well, hopefully we've now defined adaptation, and you can all do that, and you've got that written in your books. You can probably all tell me how adaptations help animals to be camouflaged, or to be different temperatures, or survive at different temperatures. And you can probably all tell me something about how they might help them to feed, particularly with reference to Darwin's finches. You should also be able to tell me now the process of natural selection, that some organisms are adapted, those ones survive and pass on those genes to their children. As always, happy isolating, and there'll be another video uploaded probably on Wednesday. Have fun.